And the problem, the issue I have with the United States, he says, is that they are the big support for the existence of independent states inside the Middle East. And these borders shouldn't exist. They should be rubbed out. So I think all of these, the really big developments in American foreign policy, have all been centered around this theme of defending, protecting, and advancing this idea of democratic sovereignty and the virtues that underlie it. Okay, so if you accept that, what's the problem today? Where do we stand with all of this? Well, I see three problems. First, over the 20th century, and I'd be happy to sort of talk about the reasons why this happened, over the 20th century, an enormous number of states were admitted into the system that are not, in fact, respectable. Now, I would be more than happy to go through and itemize this, but my favorite recent example is that in late June, the state of North Korea was given the privilege of chairing the UN Conference on Disarmament. Now, the UN Conference on Disarmament is an utterly useless and totally irrelevant organization. We had a bunch of UN delegates from the Disarmament Conference at Heritage a couple weeks ago, and we went around the table and all of them said it was utterly useless and they hated it and thought it should be abolished. Nonetheless, a state like North Korea, a declared open violator of every anti-proliferation treaty that has ever been signed, should not have even the nominal position of minimal responsibility that goes along with chairing a disarmament conference. But North Korea is legally equal to the United States, to Japan, to South Korea, to Germany, to France, to Italy, to Canada, or any other respectable democracy you care to name. And as a result, in the United Nation system, they have just as many privileges as any decent country does. Now, it's easy to harp on North Korea, and I like to harp on North Korea, because North Korea is probably the single most evil country in the world. But it has strong competition. Sudan is also a member of good standing of the United Nations. So is Zimbabwe. So is Iran. So is Saudi Arabia. We could go on and on and on. The single most important error of the 20th century was that all of these places, which are not even minimally respectable, which don't meet hardly a single one of the classical criteria for getting to be called a state, have nonetheless been admitted into the system, and now they get every single privilege that is accorded to decent and respectable places around the world. And because all of these organizations work on a one nation, one vote system, we can't vote them out because they're a majority. I think that's a huge problem. Second problem is precisely that they are now numerically in control. So people who look to international organizations to become serious problem solvers, people who look to international organizations to represent some concept of morality or even a collective security, are relying on institutions that are numerically controlled by states that have no interest whatsoever in advancing these concepts. Because if these concepts were taken seriously, they would not even be recognized as states. And yet there are a lot of people in the United States, and especially outside, who take international organizations as they currently exist very seriously. Now, if one were to say that the UN is like a conference, the UN is like this room, and anyone is free to come into this room, and you can talk in it, I could actually accept that. You know, the UN is a conference chamber. It has no moral claim whatsoever. It's just a place that people meet. I could accept that. Or alternatively, I could accept a UN that says we stand for certain core values. We stand for the achievement of the basic respectable standards of sovereignty, and therefore we have standards for membership. What is absolutely unacceptable is the idea that the UN gets to call itself a moral organization, and yet it has no standards for membership. One or the other. You can be a conference room, or you can be a club that has some standards. You can't claim the privilege of morality or international leadership if everyone gets inside. And that's where the UN is right now. They claim the privilege of moral leadership, of standing for the global citizenry, of leading the global commons, and yet they don't have any standards. That's a problem. Third, because of these first two things, a lot of people around the world don't like the concept of sovereignty anymore. Because they look at North Korea and they say, how can you possibly be in favor of sovereignty? Sovereignty is an excuse that the North Koreans use to defend the fact that they have inflicted mass starvation on their own people. And they say, well, we're a sovereign country. What right do you have to judge us? Kofi Annan, the past Secretary General of the United Nations, has been quoted in The Economist, nonetheless, as saying, quote, traditional notions of sovereignty are an obstacle to effective action in humanitarian crises. What Kofi Annan is saying here is exactly the North Korean example, or the Sudanese example, or the Zimbabwean example. All of these states have the privileges as a sovereignty because we've admitted them into the system, and the reaction of many people around the world has been to say that therefore the idea of the sovereign, self-governing nation state is fundamentally unacceptable on humanitarian grounds. And this is not simply something that people say. This is actually creating new international institutions and doctrines. Many of you will be familiar with International Criminal Court. The justification for the establishment of the International Criminal Court, of which the United States is fortunately not a member, is that, sure, you can have a domestic judicial system to try crimes against humanity, genuinely barbarous offenses. But you're not fully sovereign, because if you don't do it to our liking, we'll take the case on ourselves. And by the way, we're the ones who judge whether or not you've lived up to our standards. The justification for the International Criminal Court, in other words, is that sovereign nations are not fit to judge the proceedings of their own judicial system. You may be familiar with the doctrine of responsibility to protect, R2P as it's sometimes called in sort of nice think tank lingo. This is something that President Obama relied on explicitly in his justification of the UN intervention in Libya. Now we can talk about the rights and wrongs of that, and I would be willing to make a case that in Libya was the right thing, and I'm willing to make a case that it was the wrong thing. But what I'm not willing to do is accept the idea that the U.S. or any other country has a responsibility to intervene for the cause of humanitarianism against other sovereign states, if one accepts that they're sovereign. Finally, there's the concept of human security. If you read around in international affairs literature, this concept is all over major international treaties, many of which have already been adopted by a lot of countries other than the United States. Right now, if you Google it, you'll see that the U.S. and other countries are working towards a treaty on cluster munitions. The NGO community has been extraordinarily active in pushing a treaty on cluster munitions based on the idea of human security. In other words, states are not fit organizations to control their own militaries. What you need is some sort of supranational treaty that defines what you're allowed to do militarily, because your own traditional rules, your own traditional judgment is unacceptable. Everyone is human, therefore states are not the right institutions to judge. I think this poses a couple of really serious problems for the United States. First of all, the more these trends advance, I think the more the United States is going to opt out of participating in the international system. And I think that's a bad thing, because I think it's a good thing that the United States, as the Founding Fathers intended, takes diplomacy very seriously. I want us to be involved internationally. But the more the U.S. is faced with the choice of participating in these kind of anti-sovereignty institutions or not participating at all, I think it's probably going to choose not participating at all, which is one reason why the U.S. has not signed the Convention on the International Criminal Court. One reason why it has not signed these various arms control treaties. We're already seeing this move of the U.S. opting out of things that a lot of other countries regard as useful or important or significant, because we regard them as fundamentally unacceptable for our interests and our sovereignty. And I think this trend is only going to get worse. So for someone who wants America to play a leading role in the world, I find this development very troubling.